Welcome to the Naavik Gaming Podcast, where it is our mission to explore the business and future of video games. We bring together the industry's brightest builders, investors, and thinkers to keep a pulse on current events, dissect emerging trends in games, share lessons learned, and have a great time. This podcast is also part of Naavik's growing ecosystem, which ranges from free and premium research to consulting and advisory services. For more information, visit www.naavik.co. Now, let's jump into the episode.
Greetings, citizens. Welcome to the Naavik Gaming Podcast. I'm your host, Alex Takei, and this is the interview and insight segment, which is part of the broader Naavik Gaming ecosystem. Today, I'm super excited to have Matt Ricchetti, the president of N3TWORK Studios, the spun-out arm of N3TWORK Inc., the studio behind legendary Game of Heroes. Matt, feel free to jump in and correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe N3TWORK Studios first came to be after Forte, a back-end infrastructure tool for blockchain game development, acquired N3TWORK Inc. in an acquisition in early 2022.
Yes, I can give you, I feel like when I talk to people about N3TWORK Studios, the first question is kind of explaining the deal that went down at the end of 2021, early 22. And it is Matt Ricchetti, by the way.
Oh, Matt Ricchetti. Sorry, that's my bad.
No worries. I get a lot of Ricchetti. It's all.
I feel the same way. My name is impossible. I get Taki, Takei. And then they don't even finish it because they're nervous.
A lot of directions.
So I apologize and empathize with knowing what that's like.
Yeah. So N3TWORK Inc. Made the decision to N3TWORK Inc. I was going to say I was part of N3TWORK Inc. before I was part of N3TWORK Studios. So we chose to sell our platform business, including about half the company. So we were 100 people, 50 people in our platform tech went over to Forte. And then the other 50 plus folks were spun out into N3TWORK Studios. And that's the company that I now run as president. So we have, like a back license to all the platform tech that we sold to Forte, because that's our analytics system and all that stuff is part of that. So I think some people have said, oh, Forte acquired you. That's not true. We sold half the business as N3TWORK Inc. to Forte. N3TWORK Studios is a totally separate company. We have our own cap table, our own board, everything. We work closely with Forte right now on Legendary Heroes Unchained, one of our 2 upcoming blockchain games. But, otherwise we're a fully independent company.
Awesome. Yeah. And so I think that your mission so far is to take some of the great mobile IP that you had in N3TWORK Inc. and pivot the studio to Web3 focus. I know that you've had a stellar career in games. Like your background is like mobile gaming's greatest hits. And prior to N3TWORK, you were president of studios at Glue, and you came up through the producer track at Kabam and Zynga at NEA. So I want to say thank you for joining me and gracing me with your presence twice in 1 week. It was great to have you on campus the other day. For the audience, I basically cajoled Matt into coming to Stanford so he could be pestered by a group of overzealous and overeager Stanford Web3 technocrats. So he was on campus. Yes,
that was a lot of fun, and I'm the kind of
people loved you.
Oh, thank you. I'm the kind of person who tends to get heads down in the business, but I really love teaching and speaking, and I wish I did more of it. So that's a great, thank you for kind of twisting my arm to get me down there. And I had a lot of fun. But yeah, in terms of my background, I've been in free to play for 20 years now, which we were talking on Monday, it was kind of the early days of free to play. So I kind of went through a twisty career where I was a Chinese philosophy major, and then got into translation and then editing, graphic design, web design, and got a job finally at EA. I'm a hardcore gamer from a young age and kind of grew up with the invention of like home console gaming and arcades and all that stuff. So I took to it really, computers and gaming as a kid, and got really into like Dungeons and Dragons and building my own adventures and all that stuff. So I didn't realize that there were careers in doing things like product management and production. I've always been kind of a generalist, so it's been very gratifying to know that you can make a career as someone who's, a generalist. I like to dabble in lots of different things. So anyway, my career has really been defined by the growth of free to play. I got in early at pogo.com. And maybe some people know it, some people don't, but it was, in the early 2000s was a $100 million business built off of subscriptions and microtransactions. And it was funny. It's kind of the opposite of the traditional free to play. Like, you had to have a subscription before you could buy microtransactions because there was no real way to get people's credit cards other than getting them signed up for a subscription. And then it's like, okay, now we can sell you other stuff. But we had an avatar system and a number of like kind of Microsoft Xbox Live achievements type of microtransactions there, and kind of set the stage. Like, that was pre-mobile, pre-Facebook gaming, pre-World of Warcraft, all that stuff. So I was really, when we looked around for examples of free-to-play gaming, it was like looking at China, Japan, Korea, and the rise of free-to-play there. And that, I kind of mentioned I had a little bit of background in Chinese philosophy from college and spent some time living in Taiwan and mainland China. So that all together was really formative for me in kind of the rise of this new business model. And a lot of my career was sort of riding that wave through PM and design roles into executive roles the last decade or so at Kabam and Glue and Purblue, and now N3TWORK Studios. But I think the lens through which I view a lot of Web3 now is this similar lens of like brand new business model, sort of lots of potentially disruptive, but a lot of people either not understanding it or seeing sort of the negative aspects of it. It can be free to play was perceived as kind of mercenary, and the sort of pay to win aspects of free to play were hurdles that had to be overcome for the model to become more widespread. And there was, like a whole period of going from pretty niche games to, billion-dollar, multi-billion-dollar success cases in the app stores. And, I'm kind of optimistic that the same journey is out there for Web3, and that we just have to have the long-term view on it.
Yeah, yeah. I think this is like a perfect segue to sort of jump into to N3TWORK then specifically.
Yeah.
But before we start, like, did you guys always have the 3 in N3TWORK, or did you like or is it like a passive Web3 signaling? Did you change it from N3TWORK with an E to N3TWORK with a 3 later, or did you guys or maybe it was like an augury of what was always intended to happen to you guys in a way?
Yeah. Maybe it was a real an augury. The 3 kind of precedes me as a member of N3TWORK Inc. and N3TWORK Studios.
That's funny.
We did have the conversation when we did a kind of a branding redesign for N3TWORK Studios, which you can see on my jacket here if you're watching on video. But we debated on whether to leave the 3 in, and that was a reason we did leave it in, is because Web3. So it's just a little part of the name. But strategy wise, I'm super happy to have a chance to talk about the studio. It's really exciting. I said we started at about 50 people. We're around 75 now. We're fully remote. So we have a lot of presence on the West Coast of the US, but also in South America and in the UK, and in other parts of the US. We're really embracing what the pandemic has given us in terms of remote work. We have 3 teams. One team is Legendary Game of Heroes. That game's grossed over $300 million in its lifetime, and has really been like the driver of the studio. And it's where a lot of our kind of expertise and orientation comes from. So, it's a match 3 squad RPG. So both of our Web3 games are also squad RPGs. And, we're looking at the space. We kind of have these like 4 insights or pillars that we've organized our 2 games around, which are, we're focused on squad RPGs, and I'll talk more about each of these if you find it interesting, Alex, and feel free to ask me more questions. But we're focused on squad RPGs. Free to own mints is kind of another pillar of especially getting our products off the ground. And then the other 2 pieces are around tokenizing guild play and doing that through what we're calling a compete to earn token. So just to start on I think there's a lot to unpack there, but the first piece on squad RPGs, like we have a decade of experience working on squad RPGs, with the kind of core N3TWORK Studios team. And then we brought in some new folks as well who have that orientation. And I think it's a great So what I mean by squad RPG is the kind of, the classic mobile hero collector game. It's a kind of game that I've worked on a lot myself in the past, particularly at Purblue. But it's, Marvel Strike Force, Star Wars Galaxy of Heroes, Raid Shadow Legends, AFK Arena, Hero Wars, Idle. There's a number of games that have crossed, the multi-million, $100 million threshold, if not the $1 billion threshold in that space. So it feels like a genre that's kind of like 4X strategy has been for mobile. It just fits free to play and mobile really well. Because it's very accessible to pick up and play. The battles are quick and easy. There's a lot of auto battling and kind of like, 3x speed or whatever, and you cruise through battles. And for the player, what's interesting is the overall kind of investment in your portfolio of heroes. And there are a lot of different kind of currencies and metagame progression vectors in these games. You got runes and gear and crafting and obviously, there's a lot of guild play that goes along with that, and the guild itself can have progression. So I think all that stuff lends itself super well to Web3. Like when you think about Web3, you think about tokenizing, and when you're thinking about tokenizing, well, you need things to tokenize. So you need a game that has a lot of meat in terms of progression and kind of relatively complex economies. So I think the gamers that play squad RPGs are pretty used to a lot of that. And, we're trying to find, I think like many people in the space right now, where's the growth going to come from? The Web3 space is really fascinating and the people that are in it are super dedicated, but it's still teeny. We're talking about thousands of daily active wallets or users in, one of the, in the top games in the space versus, millions of DAU in a top grossing RPG. So there's orders of magnitude in that gap that we need to bridge as an industry. And I think, it's much more likely that mobile gamers who are used to, like I said, these economies and this sort of a la carte kind of purchasing practice, and, games as a service and live ops are more likely to kind of migrate towards these, whether it's Web 2.5 games or Web 3 games that feel familiar to them, versus console or PC gamers who, those industries have changed a lot too, but they still are kind of dominated by, pay once and, maybe interact with some DLC. So I think it's a bigger kind of cognitive hurdle to get over for those gamers. And we've seen some more kind of resistance in those spaces around Web3 right now. So that's kind of a lot of the background on why we feel like squad RPG, I mentioned a lot of the games, but it's the second biggest mid-core genre after strategy on mobile, and probably the third overall biggest genre after, if you include puzzle. It's a multi-billion-dollar space. So, I think it can be a multi-billion-dollar space in Web3 as well.
Right. And I guess what I'm pulling out of this is that there's just a lot, you're basically just trying to pull out a lot of incremental innovations and figure out, when you're looking for product market fit, like who is the market that is going to be most likely to adopt this, right? And from that, I'm hearing, mobile, free to play, specific types of genres with specific kinds of economies that players are used to. That won't be this like gigantic difference between like what they're already expecting. Right? Like if you're building a game with no crafting system, then you're not building a system of ERC20 tokens that are interacting with the blockchain, and that behavior is not habituated already in the audience that you're serving to. So I think it's a very interesting and smart take on, okay, well, where would blockchain players like most likely to be if we had to basically pattern match habituated gaming behavior? And that certainly might be like in a hero collectible mobile game. And so there was obviously a ton to unpack there, and I'd love to dive in more. But I think one of the questions that I definitely still have is, why even haven't bothered with Web3, given that you guys already had successful games before, right? I think unlike some of the other studios that we usually have on the podcast that are building new Web3 studios from scratch, you guys are kind of pivoting from a Web 2 world to Web 3. So, you had successful games with Legendary Heroes Unchained. What's going to happen to the old games? And sort of was this more of a offensive move to sort of say like, okay, I think we can do this? Just walk me through that process before we dive into the free to own and the loyalty passes and the compete to earn.
Yeah. That's a really good question. And it's something that, I think it's a good question for free to play studios in the space to continue to ask themselves. Are you in the space for the right reasons? And the space is so nascent that I think that it's kind of a shifting landscape. But for us, I think kind of on the external market conditions, perspective, like free to play gaming has changed a lot in, the 20 years that I've been in, and especially the last, I would say 5 to 10 years, we've seen a lot of consolidation. We've seen user acquisition become a very different kind of game and experience, especially for small studios. Like personally, I've always gravitated, not always, but I would say more recently gravitated to small studios because I like, being entrepreneurial, being innovative, being collaborative. And I think as a small studio and free to play, it's just gotten very, very difficult to achieve scale on the marketing side. And then, the cost of making games has gone up. And the size of teams and the cost structures you need to be successful in free to play as a small studio is very difficult. And I think that's, kind of why we've seen a lot of consolidation. For the small studios, it made sense to partner up with bigger studios and those economies of scale they have, particularly around marketing. And then for the bigger studios, it's kind of the innovator's dilemma where, you reach scale and, there's always been this kind of big split in gaming. And I guess you could say particularly free to play around being an operator versus a builder. Like being an operator is a whole set of different skills than being a builder. And, as you become a bigger game, that's kind of inherently, if you're going to have revenue, you're managing live games, right? So it becomes the innovator's dilemma is around how do you also build? And I think a lot of companies have found it easier to grow inorganically, to acquire smaller companies and bring new genres in. So that's kind of like the free to play landscape. So I think there's an element there where smaller free to play developers and entrepreneurial free to play developers are saying, rather than trying to compete in this like super red ocean, there is a more blue ocean space in Web3. Particularly last year, that was a much easier argument to make. And I think now it's more of, do you have that long-term conviction? So, there's the external marketing conditions. And then personally, I have like a depth of belief in the long-term kind of inevitability of digital ownership, right? Like you were asking me about the guitar that's sitting behind me. And I like to use it as an example of, as a hobbyist musician, you're always kind of buying and selling gear, right? And in the physical world, you can do things like, do I want to have another bass guitar or another drum set and kind of have a collection? And I play different ones for different types of songs and different reasons, and I show them off. Or do I sell the one I have because I want to buy a better one? And, I don't have all the money right now to buy two. So I, use the proceeds from that. Or do I give it as a gift to a friend because I want to get them involved into playing music or playing together? I think all those things are very analogous to our digital lifestyles. And I think the pandemic has kind of accelerated a lot of that process where we're living more and more online and we're interacting with digital goods more than ever. And I think those things together are bringing new expectations for users of digital goods to have kind of parity with the physical world, which is that, and that's where the ownership comes in. It's like, this is my good. If I want to trade it, sell it, do whatever to it, transform it somehow, I have the control over that. So I think, having been in the game industry long enough and spent thousands and thousands of dollars as a player in free to play and also operated games where I've seen players treat their free to play game like a true hobby. I want to see those hobbyists be fully enabled to be owners, and controllers of their hobby. So I think at some level that's inevitable, right? And obviously it's a tough market right now, but I think you have to have that conviction long term to kind of, everybody says like bear markets are when the successful companies are built. So, you have to kind of be into that right now to get through the next.
So for you guys, it was basically like, look, like we know that we can get on the front foot here. And so we're going to go out here and take a stab at attacking a market that it's been underserved. So for you guys, it's very much a offensive move versus a defensive, if we don't pivot, we won't survive situation, which is, I think, a little bit of a distinction between someone building it from scratch versus, I think I've talked to a lot of founders who kind of just threw Web3 in their deck to just, and then pray, right? And so I'm going to cheat a little bit.
That's happening a little bit with AI right now, right? There's always a shiny new thing.
Yes, exactly. And so it's like, are you building this Web3 game for the right reasons, or are you building this Web3 game because Web3 is inherently fundable or AI is inherently fundable? And so I'm going to cheat a little bit because you just gave me a presentation. I know that in order to go out on this offensive move, you guys are planning to build 2 games, one utilizing the Legendary Heroes IP and the other building a new IP. And I would love for you to tell me a little bit about, like why build 2 games at the same time? We talked a little bit about like the 4 strategies they're connected to, the squad RPGs, the compete to own, the free to own, and some of like the guilds and loyalty passes. But why 2 games? What are they meant to be targeting, etc.?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, just to go back and kind of tie a bow on the last point. So it's a bit, I was talking about how the market conditions, personal conviction of me, people like Neil, who's the executive chairman of the board and one of the founders of N3TWORK Inc, who put this whole deal together to create N3TWORK Studios. But then there's also just being really honest with yourself about what are your skills and your specializations. And that's where we kind of go back to making RPGs, making game as a service, squad RPGs. That's the studio's been doing that for decades. I've been doing that for a long time. I think there are many ways to kind of approach the Web3 space. And I think it's certainly just as legitimate to come from it without any sort of, as much as knowing a lot about free to play can be an advantage, there's a lot of baggage there too about how things have been done in the past. So I think we're going to be hopefully, leveraging everything that we know to have success in the space. And it's going to be a lot of knowledge share between folks like us who are coming at it from the free to play angle versus people are going to have, like we saw this in the early free to play days, the brand new free to play startups who had kind of no tether to the pre-free to play gaming business models were often the most innovative. And I'm sure there are going to be success cases in that space too. But anyway, okay, to go to the games, as a small studio, you don't have an opportunity to have a 10 product portfolio approach. So for us, 2 products is kind of gives us a little bit of a portfolio play in the sense of Legendary Heroes Unchained is a pure Web3 game in the sense that all the heroes, the gear are all going to be NFTs. The game's kind of targeted towards a crypto audience. And we feel like, if we want to be legitimate in this space, we need to understand that audience well, understand what appeals to them and be able to build games that audience are going to enjoy and invest in. And on the other side, Triumph, which is our new IP. So a lot of the leaders and builders of Legendary Game of Heroes went over to Triumph, and this was kind of like, okay, you built a highly successful free to play RPG. What's like your dream next game that you'd want to make? And that's what Triumph is. But because we had it in the works for a while, we were thinking about what makes the best. We wanted to kind of authentically move into Web3 as a whole studio. What's the best application of that vis-a-vis Triumph? It felt like kind of forcing the game to kind of turn on its head and be an entirely Web3 from the ground up. Didn't quite make sense. And then also, again, there's kind of like the internal, external. Externally, I think there's a big opportunity for this kind of Web 2.5 play. And I think that's become even more viable as the market's shifted, right? Like, last year it was kind of Web3 or bust. And now people are kind of more sanguine about, okay, we've got a ways to go. We've got to build the market. We need to make sure we're appealing to people outside the Web3 space as well. So Triumph's strategy is the economy is heroes and gear. It's all IAP based, but we're layering some Web3 systems on top of it. And again, trying to not do it in a way where it just feels grafted on, but that it's really a holistic game economy. But making sure that those things that are being layered on, like the assets that can be earned in Triumph. So it's going to be things like cosmetic NFTs, tokenized guilds, a loyalty pass that will be an NFT for Triumph. Those are all things that players can earn. We're not looking to come out of the gate and say, hey, we're going to sell you a bunch of NFTs. It's like, just play the game. You'll have an organic experience. You get exposed to Web3, and then, you'll be able to trade on the secondary market and do things like cash out and own your assets. But the idea is to kind of bring people in gradually, and if the game sees success, we can lean more into the Web3 parts of it.
Got it. So you got one game serving degens, which I think is going to look very similar to a lot of the games that we've already seen. This is like your crypto raiders, your like Axie Infinities, where like Web3 is native to the onboarding process. And then you've kind of got this like hybrid Web 2.5 where you can engage with this system or not, but we're kind of going to educate you into the system. And then we're going to offer things that are more standard to like the mobile free to play space, like loyalty passes, etc. I would love to dive a little bit deeper into this, into like the live op monetization that you're planning for Triumph. I think the Legendary Heroes Unchained is probably more similar to a lot of the web generation 1 and generation 2 games that are being built. But I think like strategically and incrementally implementing Web3 is has a variety of like people are taking a stab at it in a variety of ways. I would love to learn a little bit more about like the tokenized guilds and the tech trees that you guys were talking about on campus the other day. I think those are really interesting and think cases of monetization tools that I haven't heard about yet.
Yeah, so we kind of went through this process over, you start a new studio and there's a lot to do in terms of just hiring and logistics and operations and get everything off the ground. And I think we had this general split between a Web 2.5 and a Web 3 title pretty early on. But, the space evolves very rapidly. And we were kind of asking ourselves, like, what's the right way to tokenize an RPG? And there aren't a lot of examples out there. I think I've seen some really good, I was looking at examples like, Shrapnel was one. It's another portfolio investment for Griffin Gaming Partners. So
that's actually super funny. I discovered Web3 because of Don Norbury, their CTO. Okay. He's a friend of the indie studio that I was at on the engineering side. And I had like a meet and greet with him. And then he was like, I'm building this Web3 thing. And I was like, what's Web3? And that's actually like how I legitimately discovered Web3 as a topic. Oh. Yeah, which is just very, very interesting that it's like now, like here's a huge player of like an anticipated like extraction Web3 shooter. And at the time I was like, I don't really know what they're building. That's cool. Sorry, I interrupted you.
I'm an avid consumer of all their kind of materials, including their white paper. I think their presentation and the way that they communicate about approaching Web3 is very thoughtful. And so like that model, just kind of looking at models that I was seeing multiple examples of the same model of. So the Shrapnel example is UGC, right? I think there's a real good argument for UGC and Web3 fitting together, right? This idea of, NFT and creator royalties are something we've seen in the art space. If you can make UGC for a game, so something that's kind of a piece of art, but also has mechanical utility in the game, that's all the better. And if you can build a whole game around that, then you've got this interesting set of roles, between creators and purchasers and owners. And Shrapnel does that with, there's not only skins that are cosmetic things, but also maps. And I just would recommend people reading about how they're planning to do UGC around maps as a really good example of like NFTs that have, in-game mechanical impact. And then another model I think I've seen a number of examples of in the Web3 space is the sort of enter a tournament and use a token to get into the tournament to win more of the token. And it's, using a token as an entry fee and taking a rake. And that's been something that's been done with cash on the, in mobile and other platforms, but it just fits really naturally in, like, so Rare does that, Skyweaver does that. And I was like, well, none of these are RPG games. And like, we don't really like, we could go the tournament route and be very competitive, but that's not the squad RPG, right? There are skill-based RPGs that are more about, the twitchy tactical gameplay. Maybe Champions is going to be an example of a game like that. But it's not really like our bread and butter. And then on the UGC side, I think there's maybe some opportunities, but Guild of Guardians, I think, is a good example where they're sort of the way they've structured their guilds and then the crafting of all the individual members of the guilds feels like UGC. You're not really making something brand new. You're making something like within the parameters of the game, but you're doing it in a collective way and then ultimately tokenizing those kind of individual components that get crafted into gear. So for us, we kind of landed on guilds, like guild play has always been the heart of any RPG that I've been involved with, and it's certainly the thing that keeps me engaged in an RPG for months and years on end. And I think there's a lot of great research, that I've done on games that I've worked on and also read that shows that, players who join guilds are more likely to stick around. They're more likely to pay. They're very likely to stick around, not just in the early retention phase, but in the late retention phase. So guilds is kind of where everything comes together in terms of the community social experience, and people always refer to Web3 as community economics. So like we want to bring the tokenization to the community. So what we're thinking about doing is having a research tree, just a standard sort of research tech tree, like think about Civilization or any kind of game that has a tech tree in a guild. And it's not a rocket science, new feature. I think there are RPGs and free to play out there that have tech trees of various types. The difference though is that there will be either paths or nodes within the tech tree that can only be upgraded through spending a project token, a fungible token. So we'd have like a Triumph token and an LHU token. The way you'd get that token is strictly through leaderboard position. So, I think we've all kind of learned that anything where the token payouts kind of scale off of the user base or the number of users participating is incredibly inflationary, and we want to avoid that. I think like some of the competitive tournament-based systems that I mentioned in other games are good examples of ways people have been effectively avoiding that. So we would use, you have to be good. So there's even though it's a squad RPG and getting good heroes is a function of both of skill and paying. There is that's the compete to own part. You've got to win. You've got to be dedicated. You got to put time. It's a mix of time, skill, and potentially investment of money or whatever to do well in these events. And then you can earn a limited amount of tokens, and that allows us to kind of on a seasonal basis figure out what the appropriate token distribution should be to the player base. And as the player base grows and sinks, we can kind of keep the token distribution in tune with the players and kind of prevent runaway inflation. And then the players there's kind of an intermediate step here. So we work staking into the games by saying, okay, you're going to stake your project token for a certain amount of time. We have to kind of figure out the details, but let's say it's the whole season. So you stake your tokens for the season. When those tokens are locked up, when the season's over, your tokens will spit out a number of research points for your guild tech tree. And the more tokens you stake, the more research points you get. And then you contribute. So the interesting part in the economy is that a player can then decide, do I want to contribute, my tokens, stake my tokens to the guild specifically, or am I kind of
for the greater whole, for the good of the guild or for myself? Right. I love this. Yeah. It's like very similar to like syncing and stuff in Diablo seasons and kind of knowing that at the end of this, like we're going to either get some material output that will help us like in the next journey, which is fascinating. So like if for Shrapnel, their killer use case is UGC, for you guys, your killer use case is like this unit, your guilds, like your homies and your army, basically being able to progress more rapidly through a tech tree, which would ostensibly give you some sort of actual play advantage.
Exactly. Right? Yep.
Interesting.
Yeah, and there's kind of endless ways we could design and sort of skin the cat when it comes to the tech tree. You can have like, your fire heroes are more powerful, or you earn more currency from a mode. So there can be kind of combat benefits, economy benefits, more sort of VIP style convenience benefits where you can just play the game quicker, easier. And then there can also be kind of seasonal benefits that are more consumable, right? Like ultimately, I think things become more sustainable when there's almost like a battle pass style rhythm of earning tokens and sinking those into benefits that are going to allow you to perform better in the specific season and whatever kind of mechanics the season is themed around. But those benefits will then either wear off or just not really be as relevant for the next season. So that, this tech tree is not a finite tree. It's something that grows over time and has a live ops cadence to it that goes hand in hand with, there's sort of an input and an output, right? The input is you do this seasonal event, you earn the token, then you invest it in the seasonal benefits for the next season, right? Because there's the lag with staking. And it becomes this virtuous circle that is hopefully fun, and it's intentionally designed for more elder players. Like there will be a significant portion of the tech tree that's also an off-chain investment for everyone in the game, that, an advantage of being in a guild will be, you don't have to be a big whale or whatever. You can get in a guild and, be kind of lower on the totem pole, but still take advantage of the tech tree bonuses that the guild is offering.
Sure.
So
yeah, it's just like very interesting. It's like a combination of like what we often do in free to play and mobile games, which is basically like sunset stuff that people bought to make it totally and utterly useless. So people have to buy new stuff again. And so I'm actually going to maybe ask you a tougher question. And I'm stealing actually from a very astute classmate who made this great Twitter post actually after you left the other day. She wrote, Web3 gaming companies are at the risk of seeing themselves repeat the centralized WoW soul siphon nerf that Vitalik so hated. The alternative for most is to let their game meta be set in stone, which hardly feels viable. What is the middle ground, and has anybody cracked this? So respond.
What's the crossfire thing? Dana Carvey used to do that on Saturday Night Live. Discuss. And that I don't know if that was the same person that asked that question when
it is. Yeah.
I thought it was a great question because, free to play often depends heavily on power creep, right? So whether the content obsolescence is kind of implicit or explicit, it happens either way. And in games that tend to be more aggressive on the monetization side, there can be a very explicit, like, the new heroes that come out or the new whatever that comes out is just clearly more powerful than the stuff in the past. And I think free to play developers, kind of live in that space of like, how much power creep do we want? And how do we kind of work with players to make it something that's palatable? And there are parts of that. Yeah, I think done well, it can be there can be a good partnership with the community, but done poorly or, with not the right intentions, it can be pretty painful and shitty and not very fun. So I don't know. I have mixed feelings on power creep. I think power creep is definitely going to be harder in the Web3 space. Like the last thing you want to do is sell people stuff and then undermine its value, within any kind of like near-term amount of time. That's not going to feel good, and I think games like Magic or Pokemon or whatever all kind of live in that space, and they found other ways. Magic has lots of different formats, and they move people through different card blocks in the tournament setups, so that they kind of have a more explicit hard wall of obsolescence, but it's about recency rather than about power, right? And for some people that can be hard to swallow, right? Like I do see people complain about like if the acceleration of releases, happens
gets so fast,
it gets high enough, then people are like, oh shit, I can't keep up with all these new cards that are coming out. There are pros and cons, to any system that you adopt. But I think my real answer to that question is that no matter what kind of game you operate, you need to have a really strong relationship with your community. You need to be like, I'm a big fan of, you got to put out really detailed patch notes about every hero that comes into the game and every change to the way the combat system works. Like you want your players to really understand what the meta is and why. Because I think if you do that, players will come along with you on a journey. Like people don't generally want to play a game, whether it's League of Legends or it's, Disney Heroes Battle Mode, which is a game I worked on at ProBlue. They don't want a static meta. They want the game to feel alive and fresh, and they want reasons to, employ their new heroes because the heroes are fun and they're cool and they're collectible and you have an emotional attachment to them. So, the thoughtful way of doing that is saying, hey, not just, we're nerfing this hero because it's too powerful, but, an example might be, we think shielding is too powerful overall in the combat. And this hero is kind of an example of shielding. And what happens when shielding dominates the metagame is that combat's really slow and sluggish and you just sit there and watch none of the day. It's like, is that fun for people? And that's usually what happens, right? It's like that as a developer, you're trying to keep everything as balanced as possible, but inevitably you release something that's a little OP in one way or another. And players are like, yeah, we don't like all this shielding. So like, let's have a dialogue about like what would make combat better with the players. And that's where you get into things like, oh, we're going to have shield breakers. We're not just going to nerf your hero. We're going to have a new hero that comes out that's a shield breaker or, what have you. That's just a kind of random example. But I think that's always been the way to solve that stuff. And I think you can do that in Web3 just as effectively. So something like the guild research system would have to be, kind of adaptable and be in a dialogue with players. And then I think, Web3 offers the opportunity to kind of formalize that dialogue in a lot of different ways, whether it's through governance token or a formal DAO. And those are things we're interested in. But I think the hurdle of just having a fun and exciting Web3 game is such a big one. And it's so difficult, even when have full control over a game, to make something that's good, that we want to start there first. And then if we can do that, we kind of over time, find ways to give players more, like, you own the loyalty pass, we're going to invite you into this conversation and then this conversation.
Yeah. And I think it's also interesting because, like your players are obviously your community and your partners, but it's almost like presumptive to think that anybody would like want to be in a DAO for your game because you don't even know if your game is good, right? I think UGC struggles with the same problem where it's like, oh, well, like, should I build Overwatch Workshop? Because we don't even know if the base game of Overwatch is going to be popular, right? And so it's almost like this chicken and egg cycle where it's like, maybe someone would join if you had a DAO, but maybe like putting all that energy into building a DAO is actually like totally not the right thing to be focusing on, because like fundamentally, like, your game is not fun. And so, that's where you should put your efforts. But I think it's very interesting the way that you guys are ordering and thinking about it, and thinking about your players as partners. And in that regard, I also, want to talk about, you have your players as your partners, right? In terms of maybe developing and adding to like what maybe the meta might be. But you also have another partner, Forte specifically, which we mentioned at the beginning of this conversation, which is basically a back-end, infrastructure tool. And I'd love for you to share a little bit more about your relationship with Forte and the value that they provide. I think a lot of Web3 developers are struggling with like, okay, there's like the game part, but then there's like all the blockchain stuff, right? Yeah. So what's that been like? How's the relationship? What services do they provide? How do you guys work together?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think the real value proposition of Forte is exactly that. And Forte isn't the only, and they'll tell you this too, they're not the only one out there, and they're trying to, earn customers based on the quality of what they're building, just like anyone else. It's a very fragmented space, and there's a lot of choices for game developers about chains and, where to mint and everything in between, wallets and everything else. But Forte's main value proposition is that we can focus on building the games. They focus on the blockchain aspect, so that it's kind of a plug and play situation for us. And the main features or services they provide are a wallet, a custodial wallet, a chain. So their chains are EVM on Cosmos, which is also referred to as Evmos. So they're on mainnet, they're on Ethereum, which is, where you got to be for gaming, I think, and still probably the long-term play. I'd love to see, all the fragmentation to kind of disappear over time and things to converge towards Ethereum. So the chain, the wallet, payments, so both fiat in, fiat out, crypto in, crypto out, and then kind of like the APIs and the orchestration layer to tie all that stuff together and allow us to do minting and queuing and secondary market transactions and all that stuff. And I think a little bit of a hidden value prop in there too is, managing all the payment transactions. So Forte has money licenses for, doing crypto transactions, not only in the US, but around the world. It's something that not a lot of partners have. And they're very focused on, they're very focused on compliance. Which
that's huge.
Which does mean that they can be, slower at times than, there's a lot of kind of cowboy Wild West stuff that goes on in Web3. And, maybe I think that's an area where it's kind of a positive that the landscape has changed. It's sort of slowed down the timeline. Initially we were like, oh, we got to get out there ASAP, and, cowboy is more the way to go. But I think now people are kind of looking at, okay, we're playing for the long term and making sure that we're doing everything above board and complying with all the complex, very complex, ever-changing regulations around the world. So that piece is, can kind of let you sleep at night as a game developer. So what that looks like is our games will be on like a Network Studios chain. They'll each have their own project. We can have sort of as many or few project tokens as we want. It's effectively a side chain. So the advantages of that are we are looking to go for a more mass market audience, and we want things to be as simple as possible. So players, in terms of scalability and gas fees, like we're in it's a highly scalable, secure environment that's gasless because it's on a side chain and we control everything. So there's not much. The downside is there's not much decentralization there, and that also assets need to be bridged out to mainnet. Right. Or to, if you want to move them to your own wallet out of your custodial wallet.
Right.
And I'm comfortable with those trade-offs right now because I think to go back to the bass guitar example, the real value proposition is being able to play a game that has tokenization integrated in the game in an authentic way where I can own my assets and that I can cash those out. Like, people might argue that point, and I'm not saying decentralization isn't important, but I think it's kind of a walk before you run thing, like a lot of the stuff I've been talking about. And obviously, we're a company who has not done a mint yet, or we don't have anything live, so we're walking before we run as well, not just our customers. So yeah, the theory is that or the plan, not the theory, is that you will make a N3TWORK Studios account. It's just an email and a password that silently authenticates you in your custodial wallet. So you hop into the game. You may or may not have to make the account right away. On the web, you'll have to. On mobile, we can still rely on like client ID initially. So it makes the onboarding very easy. You don't have to be thinking about Web3. It can be particularly for the Web 2.5 market. It's like you can kind of cross those bridges as you get to them naturally in the game. And then, you have that wallet. And if you have, like in Triumph, where the goal is to just let people naturally earn things through the course of gameplay, that stuff just falls into your wallet. You can check it out. It feels like a regular asset. But then if you want to go list it in the secondary market and sell it to somebody else, you can. And even then, you don't need to really do much else in terms of, KYC and AML stuff kicks in at certain thresholds for transactions, or if you want to bridge out. So if you're just hanging out in the sidechain ecosystem and working within our own secondary marketplace, it's all very seamless and
Got it. Interesting. It sounds like they provide like a demonstrable amount of value, right? But I think like one of the questions that I would ask is, like it's really the custodial wallet question is, it's how do these things interact with something like Immutable's non-custodial passport they just released, or everybody's MetaMask, right? Like what are the hooks that get the people, like, again, Triumph, we talked about, is the product that's supposed to be targeting like the mobile non-Web3 user, right? But what about like your legendary Heroes Unchained people who are like the degens who are expecting to have a non-custodial wallet that are going to be sort of like forced to go into this custodial wallet world? Like, has there been any thinking about how that will work?
It's definitely something that's on Forte's roadmap to support other wallets, and I think that's the path. It seems like in the space in general, if you look at like, again, I used Skyweaver before, but the Sequence wallet is really easy to onboard with, and there's probably others. I was playing Arc8 the other day, and the onboarding is really simple there. That's probably a custodial wallet, but anyway, I think everybody's trying to crack this nut of like, how do you appeal to both the crypto audience and the mass market audience at the same time? And it's really hard to do both right now. So we're kind of picking a lane. But I think over time, we certainly would like to support both. And an example on LHU is that we're actually doing a loyalty pass. This is our free mint, and our very first mint for LHU will be. I should, we're partnering with someone, and I won't front run the announcement here, but we're going to do the mint on mainnet because we want to, a lot of that, we haven't talked about free to own mints, but our take on free to own mints is that it's a wonderful way to build, some street cred and some recognition around your project to get people into the project. And hopefully they're people that are, they're either degens or, people who are just kind of already excited about the project, and you're giving them an asset that, for us, it's a loyalty pass. So, Azura Games Hopefuls Mint, or what Digidaigaku did, they're more kind of like PFP assets that have, Champions did something like this too, that has a bunch of kind of other game benefits that go along with it. Ours is just kind of this pure loyalty pass asset, but it gives you special access to us as a developer, in Discord and other channels. It gives you, getting on allow lists for future mints and discounts, and it gives you in-game benefits. So, these are all things that our players really want. So getting them into their hands for free, hopefully is kind of helps supercharge your early cohorts of your game, which is something that's hard to do. We were talking at Stanford the other day, like when you're building through a Discord, we've got 40,000 plus people in the LHU Discord right now, but we know very little about them because the kinds of analytics you have access to are very superficial. So getting people to kind of connect their wallets in and getting people who want this loyalty pass starts to give us the next level of read
detail.
Who's our audience and who's going to actually be paying for our primary market sales.
I think we could go.
Yeah, so we are kind of going around the custodial wallet there just because we want to get exposure. I do think that that's, one of those trade-offs you're making by having a more insulated ecosystem like we're building is, a lot of the degens are all, they're all in the big centralized exchanges, and you kind of wall yourself off from those. So we're trying to find ways to sort of have our cake and eat it too with the side chain that we'll be on.
Yeah. But I think it's also extremely challenging. I mean, I think like in this free to own concept and some of the games you've mentioned, right? Those have targeted a specific kind of audience. And even when I think about the Super Bowl ad that happened, you could also pay $6.5 million to get Twitter followers and test your tech stack, which is what Gabe basically did. But there's only 4,000 of those things. And you had to pre-link your Discord and your non-custodial wallets so that when you scan this QR code, you could get a dragon or whatever it is. But like, who's going to do that, right? Like, it's like, I was reading an article that like 100% of the people that got this were already Web3 native, right? There's 70% were already pre-existing wallets and 30% were new wallets, but they're probably burner wallets. And so I think, and this is kind of like a interesting, like, I guess, conundrum where, doing one thing targets one group versus doing another thing targets another group. And I think it's just very interesting to think about the strategy that different Web3 studios are kind of pursuing. But yeah, in that vein,
acquisition challenges that everyone's facing in mobile, they don't just go away because you're in Web3. And Web3 does have a great sort of community that's built by word of mouth and, sometimes by hype in a negative way, but I think in a lot of positive ways around hype too, is like getting people excited about what you're doing, how you're innovating, what your game looks like, and more and more people want to see and potentially play the game before they start to invest in it. But it's still incredibly hard, like, to build a community from scratch. And we're kind of, I think we have a traditional performance marketing UA team that really has been transformed dramatically in the last 6 months as we've gotten into partnering with DAOs and working with influencers and building our social media and building a Discord channel and figuring out like how to do interesting interactive work on the Discord. Like it's a totally different approach to marketing, and you have to somehow hybridize between the sort of, I guess I'd call that more traditional product marketing that you're doing in the Web3 space versus the performance marketing that you've traditionally done in Web2. And I don't know that anybody's like, figured it out. Yeah. It's going to be a battle.
Yeah. And then I guess to start beginning to wrap up, you mentioned, getting players excited, getting people excited about the game. I want to hear a little bit more about how you've generated enthusiasm for Network specifically. Today Web3 is in a pretty tricky spot. It's definitely gotten a lot more silent than it used to. And I saw you recently pulled a pretty big hire from Tinder, Josh Sell, to be your guys' CEO. Can you share sort of how this happened and how do you convince somebody to go work at Network on a Web3 game?
Yeah, it's interesting. I was reflecting on this and kind of shared at All Hands a couple months ago that roughly half our company is new because we were about 75 now. We started about 50. But I think there were some people when we made the transition to Network Studios who had a moment where like, am I in for this new journey into Web3, and kind of opted out. So that left us with a core of people who are working on the titles that, we had all 3 titles already in the works when we made the switch to Network Studios. And I think all the teams are really invested in their products, which is great. Like, it's one of the things I love about the studio is just a lot of good kind of cultural vibes around what we're building. I've always felt like, because product and content making is such a hit driven business, you have to have good people and good teams and good process, and then kind of rely on the turning of that crank to ultimately output good product. Obviously having good product strategy and innovative ideas and product are important too, but ultimately a lot of it comes down to just the day-to-day execution and having, really well-motivated teams. So Josh is kind of a part of this new wave of people that have come into the studio. Some people who we hired before the bear market hit that were really excited about Web3. And then, I think there's just, frankly, less of those people after the bear market kind of kicked in, but they're still out there, and they're people with the longer term conviction in the space. And, I think there are a lot of people from free to play who also see, the challenges, kind of like myself, right? Like they like working at small studios. They like games where the development timeline is fairly short, and you get to, all of us love games as a service because of the interactivity with, the consumer, and being able to release updates very, very quickly and getting reads on things very quickly and being very data driven. So I don't think it's impossible. Like I haven't found attracting people to the studio to be that difficult, even in the bear market. But it's a risk, like for going into Web3 right now, and not everybody has the appetite for a small startup. Josh, in particular, is somebody I know really well from working together at Glue, and I did kind of a widespread search for. Until Josh joined, I was like the only executive in the studio, and I was like, I really need some help on the executive side. I've got too much on my plate. I'm not spending as much time on product as I would like, and so it's really just Josh had already kind of, I guess, red pilled on the Web3 space and was working in a Web3 startup. And I just caught him at the right time where he kind of backed away from his initial startup that he was involved in to become more of an advisor, and was looking for something new, and it was a good fit. And we, again, so much of it is just getting along and knowing somebody and working well together. So the way we're kind of doing it is, having two executives, it's nice where, rather than having a traditional, like he's the operations guy and I'm the strategist, we're kind of splitting it, and we're each focusing on one of the two new Web3 games with the rest of the team, and then kind of sharing a lot of the operational work together.
Cool. So nice, thank you for sharing that.
Yeah.
It's just very interesting, because I think there's like this duality of motivations that I've noticed in Web3 founders. Type 1 is like Saitama from One Punch Man. If you don't know One Punch Man, it's basically like he's so ludicrously strong that he can defeat everything with one punch. And so like nothing is arduous to him. And so like that's the first type of Web3 founder, where they're like, I've defeated everything that has ever crossed my path, and like, let me go into Web3 and see if I can defeat this thing. And then type 2 is like the proselytizers, right? Like the panegyrics, who are the ideological believers of the Web3 revolution. And so I think it's interesting when you're looking for talent, which pitch do you kind of go with, right? And like the ideological one may have become a little bit more muted in this bear market, but I think that the people that are looking for a new challenge, right, it's just a very cool way to say like, hey, here's this red ocean, like you had said in the beginning. Here's this blue ocean. We've been in a red ocean. We're going to go to this blue ocean now, and we're going to see what we can build, which is super, super cool.
But jump into the blue ocean with no boat and no
boat, right.
No life raft.
Boat.
Swim for the nearest island we can find.
Yeah, and then as a final closing question, right? You mentioned at the beginning of the podcast, you studied Chinese philosophy, and I think you mentioned the other day that you actually had intended to become a professor in Taoism. Is there anything that you actually take from your studies that are guiding principles as a leader today, and that influence you in terms of how you live your everyday life and manage a studio?
Yeah, that's a good question. Yeah, thanks for asking something a little more personal and softer, because I think sometimes that does get overlooked a bit, and actually does factor a lot into, who we are. I think just in terms of managing stress, I still do a lot of meditation and breathing, because being a startup,
I have a lot to learn from you.
A startup CEO in a really challenging environment. There's some days where I'm like, this is, how's this all going to work? And you have to sort of disassociate from some of that a little bit, and, kind of put your head down and just focus on what you can control. It's almost like the it's a very Buddhist kind of approach to Web3. It's like, where can we innovate? What can we control? Like, we don't have unlimited resources. We're just a startup. Like, how do we do the best we can every day to improve? And I think, it's kind of helped me over the years. I think I gravitated towards, Buddhism and Taoism because I am a fairly high strung person and I'm really driven. And, that's kind of a double-edged sword. Like, on the one hand, it helps me get a lot done. I can multitask. Being a generalist who kind of, I kind of know what's going on over here in engineering, and I have a sense of the metrics and I have the strategy, and I'm trying to always be holding all those things together at the same time. It can be kind of exhausting, and you can get yourself in a mode of being a little hyper vigilant. So you need to find ways to just like turn it off, and it's valuable for creativity too. I think, especially with remote work, I've found that you don't have the walking into the kitchen, having some casual conversations, and maybe they go off on a cool game that somebody's playing that kind of sparks an idea in your head of how you might take a cool new feature and adapt it to your game. Like, you just don't get any of that. You're stuck by yourself sitting alone, and it's easy to be kind of overly wrapped up in just the stuff that's right in front of you. So like stepping away to pick up the bass or go on a walk or meditate or whatever, a lot of times those are the moments where you can have, your most innovative thoughts. So, gaming, you're never going to get away from the art and the science of it. And I think you have to find ways, even as a CEO or whatever, to kind of embrace the art and the creative and the innovative parts of it and make the space for that.
Yeah.
So I think
Matt, this has been
that's the thing that
totally remarkable. I'm ready to learn. I need to meditate. I'm not an evangelist personality, to go back to your last question. I'm much more of like, here's what I do, take it or leave it, and I feel that's kind of the way I've bring people into the studio too, is just to sort of be honest about stuff. And, hopefully what we're doing is something you're interested in, but if you're interested in Taoism, that's I'll talk your ear off if you want. Mm-hmm. No, I took an entire course this year called Managing the Science of the Frankie Human Mind. And it's literally about managing your inner narrative, right? A lot of us manage our external career as well, but managing your inner narrative of like what you tell yourself, how you get yourself through loss or failure is really important. And it's super critical to the entrepreneurial founder journey. So I think it's actually like, having Taoism and Buddhism as a like kind of a foundation from which to like begin to lead and begin to, build is actually really awesome. But this has been totally remarkable. Yeah.
Yeah. A lot of the core teaching of Buddhism is how to deal with suffering, right? And the fact that we can't escape suffering, right? And that's true. You just made that point. It's like, you're going to have failure in your career. And the reality is most startups fail, right? So, and most games are not successful. You're playing a baseball batting average with games. So learning how to deal with things not working out and using that as fuel to like do better in the next thing is really critical. I definitely still have this expectation that everything is going to be a success. And, it's a constant battle to kind of live with that.
Right. Well, gosh, thank you so much for sharing, learning from all the things you guys are building at Network. If there's Web3 talent out there that's interested in Network, how can they get in touch with you?
Let's see. I'm on the Twitters. God, I'm not super active on social media because that's one thing that I do to kind of keep myself from getting too much FUD and doom scrolling and all that. Let's see. What's the best way? I mean, I'm okay with people reach out to me at my Network email address, which is just mricchetti@network.com. You got to figure out how to spell my name and remember the 3 in Network to bring it full circle. So
nice. Well, that means that you need to, it's actually, you're putting in some friction. So you only get the people that are really serious. Right. On that note, like, thank you so much, Matt, for coming. This was a fantastic and an awesome interview. Thank you to our listeners, and I'll be back in 2 weeks. Until next time, friends, feel free to hit me up at alexandra@naavik.co if you have any questions, comments, or concerns. Would love to hear your feedback. And with that, au revoir. See you next time.
If you enjoyed today's episode, whether on YouTube or your favorite podcast app, make sure to like, subscribe, comment, or give a 5-star review. And if you want to reach out or provide feedback, shoot us a note at podcast@naavik.co or find us on Twitter and LinkedIn. Plus, if you want to learn more about what Naavik has to offer, make sure to check out our website, www.naavik.co. There, you can sign up for the #1 games industry newsletter, Naavik Digest, level up your insights with our premium research platform, Naavik Pro, or contact us to learn about our wide-ranging consulting and advisory services. Again, that is www.naavik.co. Thanks for listening, and we'll catch you in the next episode.